Greetings, family. This is your brother Jeremiah, and I'm back again with another video. Now, this video is in regards to the conversation between the so-called serpent in the Bible and the biblical character Eve and Adam. Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know that the serpent approached Eve and started the conversation with her. All right, so the title of this video pretty much is Conversation with a Snake. All right, so without any further delay, I'm just going to go ahead, jump into this, and get it going. All right. Now, starting off in chapter 3, this is the chapter of the conversation between the woman Eve and the snake, also known as the serpent. All right. Now, this is one of the most important chapters in the Bible, as well as the most relevant to today's culture. Now, let me explain. Now, if you followed any of my other videos thus far, you already know that this serpent is not a snake. He's the leader of the reptilian race of humanoids. All right, and before you think that I'm getting into a lot of spookism, let me just go ahead and build on the title of this serpent. The title of this serpent is Nakash. All right, Nakash simply means the whisperer. Christians refer to him as Satan or the devil. Muslims refer to him as Shaitan, also known as Iblis or Halal, among other names. This Nakash in Genesis chapter 3 is walking and he's talking. All right, he's the most cunning being of his kind, Genesis 3:1. And remember, Nakash was also a diligent observer as well as a divine enchanter of spells. And if you read any of my books, my scrolls, from the Alien Scripts 1 or 2 or both, you know that I build quite extensively on the Nakash and his kind. Okay, the Nakash Halal saw and knew about what God told Adam. So he knew he couldn't approach Adam. However, he could approach Eve because Eve wasn't present when the Lord God gave out the very first command to Adam, according to Genesis chapter 2, verse 16 and 17. And I quote, I'm going to read it. Genesis 2:16, 17. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Okay? Now, it was in the very next verse that the Elohim decided to make Adam a helpmate. Right? Some refer to that as a wife. The serpent knew that he could manipulate Eve a lot easier than he could manipulate Adam. So he seized his chance and snuck up on Eve and began whispering the hypnotic spell on Eve by asking her about the tree in Genesis chapter 1. Okay, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, yea, that God said, ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden. Now, family, pay attention to that verse. Doesn't this sound like a person you know that already knows the whole entire story, but yet will set you up by pretending to be ignorant? Then ask you a question in order to see what you know by how you respond. I'm sure you dealt with that before. And this is the same thing that the reptilian Nakash does to Eve in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. And as you continue to watching this video and listening, you are going to finally see what happened in the garden and what all the fuss is all about. All right? Now, the answer to this question is simply, you just have to simply notice in chapter 3, verse 1 of Genesis, that the serpent asks Eve a question. So we know that he's speaking to her verbally with a voice box. And we know that he's speaking clearly and legibly because Eve responds and answers him in verse 2. This means that she understands his language and he understands her language. My point, family, is that in order to speak a legible language, there must be a culture of others that speak the same language or a version of that dialect. These beings obviously must have been taught, and to teach is a way of life. Yes, the reptilian race had their own culture and their own way of life. They had institutes of learning in which they taught and learned, unless you're saying that your Bible is a lie. These serpent beings were already on the planet, and they were presumably more advanced than Adam and Eve. That's how Nakash, the serpent, knew about the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Nakash is known as a very diligent observer. So he saw and heard Adam and God speak. Nakash was very subtle, very cunning, and very shrewd. Ask yourself, who was the serpent subtle to? Okay? If Adam and Eve were the first and only people on earth, then who else was there in order for the serpent to be classified as subtle? Right? Before he had an encounter with Adam and Eve. Again, this Nakash was taught. He learned to speak fluently. It is unheard of to speak a language and not have a culture or a source from which that language sprang. Nakash was an intelligent reptilian humanoid that rose to the heights of being known as the most subtle, according to your Holy Bible. Out of all the beings living in that part of the country, Nakash, or Hillel, was more subtle than any of them. He was more cunning and more shrewd than anyone. I'm driving this point home, family, because you need to see this with your own eyes, that this physical walking and talking being, and he's not a snake slithering on the ground. If you take a close look at Genesis 3:1, you'll see the word beast. All right, the word there for beast in the Hebrew is K, right, or K. This is simply a meaning. This simply means alive, to be living, not an animal or a beast. So Genesis 3:1 should really read this way in part. Now, Nakash was more cunning and shrewd than anyone living in that part of the country, which the self-existing eternal living beings had made. Okay? The word there in verse 1 for field is Sadeh, which simply means country or flat plains. The so-called devil wasn't living in a pit of fire somewhere. He was living in a certain part of the country in Africa. So, to answer this question, if you look closely at Genesis 3, verse 2 and 3, you'll begin to see clearly that the serpent didn't lie to Eve. He did, however, set her up for the great fall. All right? In verse 2 and 3, Nakash allows Eve to speak after he asks the question. Notice, and the woman said unto the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest ye die. Nakash gives Eve the opportunity to respond, knowing that she really didn't know what the tree in the midst of the garden was symbolic of. All right? As I said earlier, he was setting this entire conversation up. He controlled the conversation from the very beginning. And this is why Nakash, in verse 4 and 5, is speaking so confidently to Eve. And he repeats, and he says, and the serpent said unto the woman, ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. The intelligence or level of knowledge that Nakash had at this point was higher than Eve's at this point. And you know this by how he responds to Eve. He tells her in verse 4 that ye shall not surely die, for God doth know. Here, Nakash, the serpent, the whisperer, defies the word of the Elohim, the God. Notice the words God doth know. Nakash knows that God, Nakash knows what God knows, and then goes on to tell Eve, which also means Nekaybaw, or tribal leader, mother of all living. He goes on to tell Eve exactly what God knows. He's haughty, right? He's very, very confident at this point. In Genesis 3, verse 5, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Now, according to Christian beliefs, the only people on the planet at this point are Adam and Eve, right? And a snake. However, did you notice the type of terminology the serpent, Nakash, uses in verse 5? He said, then your eyes shall be opened. Now we know that Eve's eyes are already open. She has a pair of eyes and they are open. Nakash is obviously not talking about Eve's physical eyes. He's speaking of what many people refer to as the third eye, a spiritual eye. The same kind of eye that are used to see and interpret the parables of Jesus or the book of Revelations, the Injil, and the book of Genesis. Alright? These are the same eyes that are used to see the truth. The fact that Nakash, the whisperer, is using this type of terminology when supposedly Adam and Eve are the only people on earth introduces a reality that these serpent beings are not only intelligent beings, but also ancient pre-Bible, prehistory beings that predate the biblical Adam and Eve. Alright? Also in the same verse, the Nakash tells Eve that they will be as gods when they partake of this fruit. In other words, this serpent being knew that the ELOHEEMs were masters of good and evil. Not just good, but good and evil. God, these beings, or the ELOHEEM, possess knowledge of good and evil, and the serpent knows this, and he informs Eve of this fact. And from this point, Eve's eyes begin to open. In Genesis 3, chapter 6, and I quote, "And the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise. So she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." Alright? So, as you can see, Eve's eyes begin to open before she ate the fruit. She began to see that this tree, not an apple, was good for food. She also began to see that the tree would make them wise like the ELOHEEM. She then took and ate the fruit and gave Adam some, and he ate. Notice that Adam didn't step in and stop this from happening, and he's right there with her. He just neglects the first command of the Bible. The first command given to Adam, and Adam alone, in Genesis 2:16. Alright, go read that for yourself. And allows Nakash, the serpent, complete access to Eve's fragile, naive intellect and her will. And Nakash took full advantage of this opportunity, and by doing so, their eyes were both open. Alright, Genesis 3:7. And the eyes of them both were open, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. So here, they're somewhere on the planet with their eyes opened, and now suddenly they know, or they realize, or they use their real eyes to realize that they are now naked. Alright? You can go over to Africa today, and in certain areas where tribes are still walking around naked. They walk around butt and breast free. You know why? Because they don't know it. It's a knowledge thing, family. The men there aren't lusting, and the women aren't lusting. Lust is a learned behavior. They simply don't know it. It's not until someone, usually an American, that goes over into their culture and their environment and then introduce new and exciting things to them. And they use the same approach that Father Nakash used still to this day. Adam and Eve didn't know of their nakedness either until they met the serpent Nakash and their eyes were open. Now, as you read further in verse 7, you'll notice that Adam and Eve began to sew fig leaves together. My question to you is the same one that was posed to me. Who taught Adam and Eve how to sew? What kind of thread did they use, or did they use thread at all? These questions introduce the reality that they were obviously taught how to sew. There's nowhere in the records to say that God, the ELOHEEM, taught them. God didn't teach them how to sew, and the other only beings that had contact with was Nakash, the reptilian being. The angels didn't come down and help them learn and taught them how to sew. So who taught them how to sew? The serpent must have had on some clothes. In order for Adam and Eve to pattern a design for an apron, they had to have seen one. They must have. So there must have been people walking around with clothes on in other parts of the country, which would explain the people in the land of Nod. But I digress, and I'll build on that a little later in another video. These were other beings living in and on the planet during those days with Adam and Eve, and they had on clothes. But why an apron, family? Why didn't they choose something else? As you know, God had to actually come down, take the apron off of them, and fully clothe them. So why a short apron? Well, in one sense, you would have to ask Nekaybaw, because he either taught them himself or he had someone he knew teach them. Either way, they decided to wear aprons. Not only did Nekaybaw manipulate them by making desire look agreeable or good, but he also tricked them into wearing very short, revealing clothes. Because as you know, aprons are very short and they're open in the back. You know what I'm saying? He did this for his pleasure. Alright? So he didn't really help them. He only made them think he was helping them when he was actually manipulating them for his own purpose and pleasure. Alright? The same thing is happening today. Our women are dressing for the serpent race, because the serpent race can't get it up, if you know what I mean. Without you, they can't raise their aprons without you. They seduce you into wearing revealing clothing, revealing clothing for their pleasure. Alright? That's a very good question. The answer to that can be seen when in the fact that Nekaybaw has been very busy since the very beginning. And his goal wasn't to undress you. Alright? That was just a byproduct of his ultimate goal. His goal was to simply make evil seem fair seeming to you. Alright? Instead of listening to the command of God, you listen to the speech or the conversation of Nekaybaw the serpent. They, the biblical Adam and Eve, were content on just living on what was given to them, and that was everything. It wasn't until they encountered the serpent being with clothing, garments on, that they realized that they were naked and that they wanted to be like everyone else and wear clothes. Again, aprons are usually short and above the knee, about mid-thigh. And you, the daughters and direct kin of Eve, are doing the same thing today, looking so good. Alright? And this is a part of the story that the Bible writers left out. You see, Eve's eyes opened, and she gained knowledge of her sexual organs as well as other knowledge. Thus, her first degree of knowledge was shame. Why shame? Go and take a look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. And it reads, "And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." You see, before they committed this so-called sin that led to the downfall of man, they did not possess the knowledge of shame. You must know shame. Or in other words, shame is something that you come to know. And this is verified in the fact that they symbolically ate from the forbidden fruit, the tree of the knowledge, keyword, of good and evil. This tree is a tree of knowledge. Most people, Christians in particular, tend to overlook this most important part of the Bible. This all started with you, man and woman, wanting or desiring knowledge. Good knowledge and bad knowledge. Right knowledge and wrong knowledge. True knowledge and pseudo knowledge or false knowledge. And knowledge is science, and science is knowledge. Science can be true or pseudo. The problem is that it's all mixed in together. It can be a challenge to find a correct path of righteousness through all that knowledge. I mean, just look at the earth situation now. We have so much information at our fingertips in which we can access very quickly. A lot of the information out there is pseudo or false, and some of it is true knowledge or true science. We, as an earth family, a human family, a humane family, right? We're falling right back into the same trap that was set for us by the conniving serpent. There is only one way out for the righteous. However, there is so much knowledge around us, so much we want to learn now, okay? But when we had the chance to learn everything in the beginning, we didn't want to. We went straight past everything we needed and went straight for everything we wanted or what we desired. And this is what led us astray. The pursuit of knowledge, whether it was true knowledge or false knowledge. Okay? Despite all of the provisions, the food, the natural shelter we were given, We were set up by a simple conversation designed to make you desire something you were told in the beginning to avoid. Okay? And now that we are in the information technology age, we all have been set up again with a net, also known as the internet, which is a trap for mortals to attempt to gain more knowledge, true or false knowledge, and absorb it quickly, as we have instant access to all types of knowledge now in this day and time. In this time, now we want to gain knowledge again. We desire science or knowledge. In other words, we are addicted to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We all desire it as a human race, and you know this is true. Alright? All the while very seldomly finding the right path or the righteous path. So, in the beginning, the straight and narrow path was simple. It was simply not to eat off of the specified tree. The knowledge tree, filled with true knowledge and pseudo knowledge, which can and will and has easily seduced Adam and Eve and most of their descendants to desire to eat from this tree as well. Alright? And nowadays, the straight and narrow path isn't so straight and narrow. Now that we have access to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so now we must gain access to everything we need, while tempering ourselves with the balancement of the true and pseudosciences, and allow the truth to lead the way with love, because truth is love and love is truth. Remember, the serpent approached Eve, the mother. He approached her with the knowledge of authority and convinced her of his pseudoscience, or knowledge of being gods and learning things or knowing things that they didn't know before. So be careful, family, of those that consider themselves authorities, because they could be setting you up for another downfall. Alright? And that goes for the religious sects and even in the fields of so-called science. Pops taught us to question and to not just believe what people are telling you, even if they are your so-called authorities. Remember, the serpent was the most subtle, or the most crafty, the most conniving and slick being in that part of the country. And he is even more so in this day and time. So you have to realistically reconsider what you know or what you think you know to be true or false pseudo knowledge, by way of having right experiences, right evidence, and right reasoning. For instance, if I show you a picture of the so-called planet, then the evidence of this picture being right evidence would be based upon whether or not the picture was actually taken from outside of the Earth's atmosphere. If the picture isn't an authentic photo, then the evidence is not right evidence. The evidence is pseudo or false evidence. If you use the experience to reveal, or if you use experience to reveal the true shape or image of your planet or your plane, the existence of your planet, you would either have to travel outside of the Earth's atmosphere far enough to see the Earth with your own two eyes from there, or take the word of those authorities that have said that they have gone to the moon themselves. Whether the proof they provide is pseudo or not, is all knowledge, good and evil, agreeable and disagreeable, true and pseudo. Alright? The tree of knowledge of good and evil has always been part of the earth initiation process, testing your true nature, being it agreeable or disagreeable. Okay? Most beings on the planet Earth is of the disagreeable nature, always seeking knowledge and basing their worth and their value upon what they think they know. And they very rarely ever realize that they have all of what they need, all the knowledge they need. They become disillusioned by their own pursuit of knowledge, to the point that they become so built up and full of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that they even begin to doubt the existence of the Supreme, the Creator, the Most High. All because they listen to the speech of the serpent. All because our ancestors, according to the Bible, had a conversation with a serpent being. All because we accepted the doctrine and the word of a very cunning, very slippery race of people who set us up with fascinating stories and knowledge, which led us to want to desire more than what was given to us, which was everything. And he, the evil serpent race, has been lying and leading us astray ever since. Wake up, family. Much peace and love. It's your brother Jeremiah. Till next time, peace.